Every saint learns obedience by suffering. The Bible tells us that fallen human nature is evil, and that evil can never be corrected by words, so all children of sin must learn obedience through suffering. Since the descendants of sinful Adam, by their very nature, cannot learn by words alone, they need a different method. The writer to the Hebrews put it as a general principle in Hebrews 12:5-11. And I have not forgotten the word which was spoken unto you, exhorting you as unto sons, saying, My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be disheartened when you are rebuked of him. For chastening does not seem pleasant at the time, but sorrowful, but afterward they that are chastened thereby bear the fruit of righteousness and peace. In the same way, a father chastens his beloved son, even making him suffer. But we know that's not what Hebrews 5:8 says, for though he was a son, he learned obedience through the things he suffered, being made perfect. The phrase though he was a son means, more precisely, though he is the Son of God. It doesn't say Jesus is a son in the usual sense, but though he is the Son of God. Jesus is the eternal, infinite, holy, righteous God. Jesus was not born with the sinful nature of all of Adam's descendants who sinned. Jesus did not know sin, 2 Corinthians 5:21. This is why it is said of Jesus, though he were a son, and this is why he did not have to suffer to punish sin. Let's also consider the phrase learning obedience. The Lord is not one who needed to learn obedience. He was God himself, but he took upon himself the form of a servant, and he was perfectly obedient to the Father, and he is not the kind of Lord who needs to learn anything. Yet the text not only says that he learned obedience, it says that he learned it through suffering. Again, the Lord is not one who needs to learn obedience, for he is God, and he is not the Son of Man who needs to learn obedience through suffering. He is the Son of God, and yet he had to learn obedience through the sufferings in order to fulfill his perfect condition and qualifications as a high priest for sinners in every way. For in the Old Testament, a high priest for sinners must first be a sinless, obedient holy man, and Jesus, who is, as the book of Hebrews says, after the order of Melchizedek's priesthood, must also be like that. That is what it means to say that he was made perfect in Hebrews 5:9. He was not made less perfect, nor did he need to be made more perfect, but he learned obedience in this way so that he might become the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him and be called a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews 5:9-10. The Lord's life, from his incarnation to his death on the cross, was a life of obedience from obedience to obedience. This was voluntary obedience. The first man Adam and all his descendants failed in obedience, but the Lord, coming into the world as a man, being obedient unto death as Philippians 2:7 says, fulfilled the righteousness of the law on our behalf without blemish, thereby perfectly fulfilling the will of God. But know this. The Lord's obedience to the Father led him to suffering and humiliation. The sufferings he endured were the inevitable price of his obedience. His life of public obedience, which began with his baptism, culminated in his second baptism, his crucifixion, and his death, which fulfilled all righteousness by enduring the agony and suffering of the cross to the end. Obedience does not come without self-denial. Obedience without self-denial is not obedience. Obedience is saying, not my will, but thine be done. Obedience is not doing it because my will is right and thy will is right. Obedience is denying self and wanting thy will to be done, even when my will is different from thy will. This is the kind of obedience the Lord himself learned through his sufferings and teaches us. As Calvin said, we all have a nature that will never submit or follow until you allow us to take your yoke upon us. The Lord says to us, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, Matthew 11:29. It is self-denial, taking up the cross, and following the Lord. This obedience inevitably results in suffering for the Lord. And obedience is a prerequisite for faith to grow. We do not learn from the Lord until we take his yoke upon us in obedience. In Matt 11:30, the yoke of the Lord is said to be easy and light, because it is a yoke we take up with him. And there is a promise in this. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls, Matthew 11:29. In every moment of our humbling, humiliation, and suffering on the path of taking up the Lord's yoke, we will experience what the Lord felt as he learned obedience. We will experience it when we walk with the yoke of Christ, when we deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow him, when we suffer for Christ's sake. And the Bible tells us that there is no affliction that God gives us that we cannot bear, and that we will always be able to overcome it. Sometimes it can be difficult to walk this path of obedience because the path of following Christ is a path of constant self-denial and cross-bearing, but along the way there is a promise that there is rest for our hearts. Even though the Lord is the Son of God, he learned obedience by the things he suffered. Saints, too, can only be tamed and learn obedience through discipline and suffering. Are you learning obedience in that way, taking up the Lord's yoke? denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following him so far? May you meditate on the Lord who learned obedience by the sufferings he endured, and may you follow in his ways, confessing that you do not want my will, but your Father's will. May the grace of this blessed obedience overflow to you in your sufferings. For those of you who listened, please be sure to subscribe and like. Let us all give thanks and glorify the Lord always.